Millionaire meets poor twins needing surgery. Their drawing shows him holding them as babies. The late autumn wind cut through the streets of Cedar Falls, Montana, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. The small, rural town, population barely 3,000, rarely saw visitors from the outside world, let alone someone arriving in a black Mercedes sedan that cost more than most houses on Main Street. Richard Sterling stepped out of his car, adjusting his charcoal wool coat as he surveyed the modest building before him. Cedar Falls General Hospital looked more like an oversized clinic than a proper medical facility. Its weathered brick facade and small parking lot, a stark contrast to the gleaming medical centers he was accustomed to in Manhattan. At 52, Richard had built an empire in real estate development, his net worth reaching heights that afforded him every luxury imaginable. Yet here he stood, in a town he'd never heard of until 3 weeks ago, fulfilling what he considered a tedious obligation. The Sterling Foundation's annual charity drive had been his late mother's brainchild, a tax-efficient way to give back while maintaining the family's philanthropic image. This year, his assistant had arranged for him to visit 3 rural hospitals, each receiving substantial donations for equipment and facility improvements. Cedar Falls was his final stop, and Richard couldn't wait to return to the familiar concrete jungle of New York. Inside, the hospital's fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over linoleum floors that had seen better decades. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something indefinitely institutional filled his nostrils as he approached the reception desk. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes looked up from her paperwork. "You must be Mr. Sterling," she said, rising from her chair with a warm smile. "I'm Martha Henderson, the head nurse. Dr. Patterson is waiting for you in his office." Richard nodded curtly, following Martha down a narrow hallway lined with outdated motivational posters and children's drawings taped to the walls. The contrast to his usual environment was jarring, where he was accustomed to marble floors and original artwork. Here, crayon sketches of smiling stick figures served as decoration. Dr. James Patterson was a man in his early 60s, his white coat showing the wear of countless 12-hour shifts. His handshake was firm, his manner genuine but tired, the demeanor of someone who had dedicated his life to serving others despite limited resources. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for coming all this way," Dr. Patterson said, gesturing to a worn leather chair across from his desk. "Your foundation's donation will make an incredible difference here. We've been operating with equipment from the 1990s, and frankly, we've been lucky not to have lost anyone because of it." Richard settled into the chair, glancing around the modest office. Family photos covered one wall, while medical journals and patient files occupied every available surface. "I'm glad we could help," he replied, though his tone suggested this was merely a business transaction. "My assistant mentioned you specifically requested cardiac monitoring equipment?" "Among other things, yes," Dr. Patterson confirmed, pulling out a thick folder. "We serve a population spread across nearly 200 square miles. Many of our patients are uninsured or underinsured, working families who can't afford to travel to Billings or Great Falls for specialized care." As Dr. Patterson outlined the hospital's needs, Richard's attention began to wander. Through the office window, he could see the main street of Cedar Falls, a collection of small businesses struggling to survive in an economy that had long since moved past rural America. A diner with a faded sign, a hardware store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, and a small grocery store comprised the heart of the town's commercial district. "Would you like to see some of our current patients?" Dr. Patterson asked, interrupting Richard's observations. "It might help you understand exactly how your donation will be used." Richard checked his Rolex, a habit that had become second nature during tedious meetings. I suppose we have time before my flight back to Denver. They left the office and walked through the hospital's single corridor. The pediatric ward, if it could be called that, consisted of 4 rooms at the end of the hall. Through one doorway, Richard caught a glimpse of a young woman sitting beside a bed containing 2 small children. Something about the scene made him pause, though he couldn't identify what had caught his attention. "Those are the Morrison twins," Dr. Patterson said quietly, noticing Richard's gaze. "Emma and Ethan, they're 4 years old, born with a rare, congenital heart defect. They need surgery that we simply can't perform here, and the family..." He trailed off, shaking his head sadly. "What about the family?" Richard asked, surprised by his own interest. "Sarah Morrison, their mother. She's 26, works 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and waitressing at the diner during the day. The father left when the children were diagnosed. She's been trying to raise money for their surgery, but the cost..." Dr. Patterson's voice carried the weight of too many similar stories. "Over $200,000 for both children. It might as well be $2 million for someone in her position." Richard found himself drawn toward the room, though he wasn't sure why. As they approached, he could hear a soft voice, the mother reading to her children from a worn picture book. The scene was painfully intimate, a glimpse into a world of struggle that existed far from his Manhattan penthouse. Sarah Morrison looked up as they entered, and Richard was struck by her appearance. She was younger than he'd expected, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and green eyes that held a combination of hope and exhaustion. Her clothes were clean, but clearly second-hand, and there was a quality about her that spoke of someone fighting a battle she was slowly losing. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Mr. Sterling from New York," Dr. Patterson said gently. "His foundation is making a generous donation to our hospital." Sarah stood, smoothing her faded jeans nervously. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "Any help for this place is a blessing." Richard's attention was drawn to the 2 children in the hospital bed. Emma and Ethan Morrison were small for their age, their pale complexions highlighting the dark circles under their eyes. Despite their obvious illness, they watched the adults with bright, curious expressions. "Are you a doctor?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, sweetie, I'm not," Richard replied, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "I'm just visiting." Ethan, slightly smaller than his sister, held up a piece of paper covered in crayon marks. "Look what we drew," he said proudly. Richard accepted the drawing, expecting to see the typical childhood artwork of houses and trees. Instead, he found himself staring at something that made his blood run cold. The drawing showed a tall man in a dark suit holding 2 babies, with a woman standing nearby. The figures were crude, as expected from 4-year-olds, but there was something unmistakably familiar about the scene. "Who is this?" Richard asked, his voice tighter than he intended. "That's our daddy," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Mama showed us a picture once." Sarah's face went pale as she recognized what her children had drawn. "Emma, honey, that's not..." she began, but stopped when she saw Richard's expression. Richard stared at the drawing, his hands trembling slightly. The man in the picture wore a dark suit, had dark hair, and was tall, details that could describe thousands of men. But something about the scene felt disturbingly familiar, like a half-remembered dream that becomes clearer upon waking. "I need some air," Richard said abruptly, handing the drawing back to Ethan. He turned and walked quickly from the room, leaving behind confused looks and unfinished conversations. Outside in the parking lot, Richard leaned against his Mercedes, his breath forming small clouds in the cold mountain air. His mind raced back 26 years, to a time in his life he'd worked hard to forget. He'd been 26 then, fresh out of business school and working for a development firm in Denver. There had been a woman, a sweet, naive girl from a small town who'd been studying nursing at the community college. Her name was Susan. No, Sarah Thompson, before she'd married and become Morrison. They dated for 8 months, and Richard had thought he might be in love until his career demanded his full attention and he'd made the calculated decision that she wasn't. Sophisticated enough for the life he planned to build, but there had been that one night a few weeks before he'd broken things off. Sarah had told him she was pregnant, and Richard had reacted poorly. He'd accused her of trying to trap him, had offered to pay for an abortion, and when she'd refused, he'd written her a check for $5,000 and told her never to contact him again. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd lost the baby, a miscarriage in her second trimester. The news had brought him relief rather than sadness, confirming his belief that he'd made the right decision in ending their relationship. He'd moved to New York shortly after, thrown himself into his work, and gradually pushed all memories of Sarah Thompson from his mind. But now, staring at this small hospital in Montana, Richard wondered if he'd been told the truth. The timeline was right. 26 years ago would make the children the right age, and the drawing. Children often had strange ways of knowing things, of connecting to truths that adults worked hard to hide. Richard pulled out his phone and called his assistant in New York. "Janet, I need you to research someone for me. Sarah Morrison, maiden name Thompson, from Colorado originally. I need everything you can find. Marriage records, birth certificates, medical records if possible." "Of course, Mr. Sterling, how urgent is this?" Richard looked back at the hospital, where a young mother was fighting to save her children's lives while working 2 jobs and facing insurmountable medical bills. "Very urgent. And Janet? I'm going to be staying in Montana for a few more days." Inside the hospital, Sarah Morrison sat beside her children's bed, staring at the drawing that had somehow captured a truth she'd hidden for over 4 years. The man who'd just fled the room bore a striking resemblance to the Richard Sterling she'd known in Denver all those years ago, though he was older now, more distinguished, wearing expensive clothes instead of the casual outfits she remembered. When she'd discovered her pregnancy 26 years ago, Richard's reaction had devastated her. His accusations and the cold way he'd handed her money before walking out of her life had broken something inside her that had never fully healed. She'd been young, naive, and completely unprepared for his rejection. The miscarriage story had been a lie, one she'd allowed mutual friends to spread because it seemed easier than explaining the truth. In reality, she'd carried the twins to term, giving birth in a charity hospital in Colorado Springs with no family support and no money. She'd named them Emma and Ethan Sterling on their birth certificates, though she'd never had the courage to contact their father. After their birth, she'd moved to Montana, hoping for a fresh start. She'd met Tom Morrison when the twins were 6. Months old, and he'd been kind enough to marry her and give the children his name. For 3 years, they'd been happy, or as happy as possible, with 2 children requiring constant medical care. But when the twins' condition worsened and the medical bills mounted, Tom had finally admitted he couldn't handle the pressure and had left. Now, watching her children sleep fitfully in their hospital bed, Sarah wondered if fate had brought Richard Sterling to Cedar Falls. The man who'd rejected his children before they were born was now wealthy enough to save their lives with what would be pocket change to him. But would he believe they were his? And more importantly, would he care? Dr. Patterson knocked softly on the doorframe before entering. "Sarah, is everything all right?" Mr. Sterling seemed quite upset. Sarah looked up, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dr. Patterson, can I ask you something? If someone wanted to prove paternity, how would they go about it?" The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you saying that Mr. Sterling might be—" "I don't know," Sarah said quietly. "But I think we're about to find out." Outside, Richard Sterling sat in his car, staring at his phone as he waited for his assistant to call back with information. For the first time in 26 years, he allowed himself to remember Sarah Thompson, not as the inconvenient complication she'd represented to his career, but as the sweet, caring woman who'd loved him when he'd been nobody special. If those children were his, he'd spent 4 years as a millionaire while his own son and daughter fought for their lives in poverty. The thought made him physically ill, not because of the potential financial obligation, but because of what it said about the man he'd become. His phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. Janet's voice was crisp and efficient as always. "Mr. Sterling, I have that information you requested. Sarah Morrison, née Thompson, age 36, originally from Colorado Springs. She has twin children, Emma and Ethan Morrison, born November 15th, 4 years ago. The birth certificates list the father as unknown, but there's something interesting. What is it? The children's original birth certificates, before the stepfather's adoption, listed their last name as Sterling, Sarah Thompson Sterling, as if she'd married you, but there's no record of any marriage." Richard closed his eyes, the full weight of the situation settling over him. "Janet, cancel all my appointments for the rest of the week and get me the name of the best pediatric cardiac surgeon in the country." "Sir, is everything all right?" Richard looked back at the hospital where his children, and he was now certain they were his children, lay fighting for their lives. "Everything's about to change, Janet. Everything." As the sun set over the mountains surrounding Cedar Falls, Richard Sterling faced the biggest decision of his life. He could walk away, as he had 26 years ago, and pretend this encounter had never happened, or he could stay and confront the consequences of choices he'd made when he was young and selfish and convinced that success was the only thing that mattered. Inside the hospital, Sarah Morrison held her sleeping children, wondering if the man who'd abandoned them before they were born would abandon them again, now that he knew they existed. The drawing lay on the bedside table, a child's innocent depiction of a family that had never been, but somehow always should have been. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change multiple lives forever, as past and present collided in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, Montana. Dawn broke gray and cold over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot where Richard Sterling's Mercedes sat covered in frost. He'd spent the night in the town's only motel, a modest establishment that was a far cry from his usual accommodations at 5-star hotels. The Pineview Inn's thin walls, dated furniture, and questionable coffee had given him plenty of time to think about the conversation he needed to have with Sarah Morrison. At 7 in the morning, Richard stood outside the hospital, watching through the windows as the small staff began their daily routines. He'd called Janet 3 more times during the night, gathering more information and making arrangements that might change everything. The pediatric cardiac surgeon he'd contacted in Boston, Dr. Emily Chen, considered one of the best in the world, had agreed to review the children's medical files and, if necessary, perform the surgery. But first, he needed to face the truth about what had happened 26 years ago. Richard found Sarah in the hospital cafeteria, a space that consisted of 6 tables and a coffee machine that had seen better decades. She sat alone, staring at a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold while her thoughts consumed her attention. In the morning light, he could see the exhaustion etched in her features, the result of years of worry, sleepless nights, and the constant stress of fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. "May I sit down?" Richard asked quietly. Sarah looked up, her green eyes wary but not hostile. "I wondered if you'd come back." Richard sat across from her, noting how she unconsciously straightened her shoulders, a defensive posture he recognized. "From their last conversation 26 years ago, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "The truth?" Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge. "That's rich coming from you." "Sarah, are Emma and Ethan my children?" The directness of the question seemed to catch her off guard. She'd been prepared for accusations, denials, or demands for proof, not this quiet, straightforward inquiry. "Why would you ask me that?" she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "Because my assistant spent all night researching public records, birth certificates with the name Sterling, a timeline that matches exactly with when we were together. And because I remember that night in your apartment when you told me you were pregnant, and I remember how I reacted." Sarah's composure began to crumble. "You told me to get rid of it. You said I was trying to trap you, trying to ruin your future." "I know what I said." Richard's voice was heavy with regret. "I was 26 years old, terrified and completely selfish. I thought my career was the only thing that mattered." "And what about when you heard I'd lost the baby? Did you feel anything then, or just relief that your problem had gone away?" Richard winced at the accuracy of her words. "Relief," he admitted. "And I've regretted that reaction every day since I walked into that hospital room yesterday." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for signs of deception. "They are your children, Richard. Emma and Ethan are your son and daughter. I named them Sterling because I guess I hoped someday you might want to know. Them." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Despite suspecting the truth, hearing it confirmed brought a rush of emotions he wasn't prepared for. Guilt, grief, and something that might have been joy under different circumstances. "Why didn't you contact me?" he asked. "When they were born, when they got sick, why didn't you tell me?" Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "Contact you? The man who threw money at me and told me never to speak to him again. Who accused me of trying to ruin his life. You made your feelings about having children with me very clear, Richard. But when they got sick, I was married to Tom Morrison. He was their father in every way that mattered, until the medical bills got too high and he couldn't handle the stress anymore." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "Do you know what it's like to watch your children struggle to breathe while you clean office buildings at night to pay for medications you can barely afford? To see other children running and playing while yours can't climb a flight of stairs without getting winded?" Richard felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. While he'd been building his empire, living in luxury, his children had been fighting for their lives in poverty. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I'm so incredibly sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix their hearts, Richard." "No, but money can." Richard opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "I've already contacted Dr. Emily Chen at Boston Children's Hospital. She's one of the best pediatric cardiac surgeons in the world. She's willing to review Emma and Ethan's files and perform the surgery if necessary." Sarah's breath caught. "I can't afford. There would be no cost to you. None at all." Sarah stared at the documents, her hands trembling slightly. "Why? After all these years, why would you do this?" Richard was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because they're my children. Because I failed them once, and I can't live with failing them again. And because—" he paused, struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. "Because you deserved better from me 26 years ago, and so did they." "This isn't about guilt, Richard. This is about Emma and Ethan's lives. I know that. But it's also about the fact that I've spent 26 years building a fortune and a career, and none of it means anything if I can't help my own children when they need me most." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, trying to process the sudden shift in her children's prospects. They'd need to travel to Boston. They're too weak for a long trip right now. Dr. Chen can arrange for a medical transport jet. Everything would be handled. The flight, the hospital stay, the surgery, recovery, everything. And after, when they're better. Richard met her eyes directly. "That's up to you. I'm not trying to take them away from you, Sarah. You're their mother. And from what I can see, you're an incredible one. But I'd like to be part of their lives if you'll let me." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Patterson appeared at their table, looking more urgent than Richard had seen him the day before. "Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Ethan's oxygen levels dropped during the night. We've got him stabilized, but..." He glanced at Richard uncertainty. "He can hear this," Sarah said quickly. "What's wrong?" "His condition is deteriorating faster than we expected. If he's going to have surgery, it needs to happen soon. Very soon." Richard stood immediately. "Dr. Patterson, I need to make some phone calls. Is there somewhere private I can work?" 20 minutes later, Richard had transformed Dr. Patterson's small office into a command center. His phone calls had reached across the country, to Dr. Chen in Boston, to a medical transport company in Denver, to his own lawyers and financial advisors. Money, Richard had learned long ago, could move mountains when applied correctly. "The transport jet will be here in 6 hours," Richard told Sarah and Dr. Patterson. "Dr. Chen has cleared her schedule for tomorrow morning. The surgery will happen at Boston Children's Hospital, one of the best cardiac facilities in the world." Sarah sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by how quickly her children's prospects had changed. I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Richard said quietly. "Thank me when they're healthy and running around like normal 4-year-olds. Dr. Patterson shook his head in amazement. "In 30 years of medicine, I've never seen anything happen this fast. Those children are lucky to have you in their lives." Richard thought about the years Emma and Ethan had spent without him, the nights Sarah had worked multiple jobs while he slept in his Manhattan penthouse. "I'm the lucky one, Dr. Patterson. I'm getting a second chance I don't deserve." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Richard had called in favors from contacts across the country, ensuring that every aspect of the children's transport and treatment would be handled by the best professionals available. Sarah packed a small bag with the few belongings they'd need, including the drawing that had started this entire revelation. As they waited for the medical transport, Richard sat beside Emma and Ethan's hospital bed, watching his children sleep. They were so small, so fragile, their pale faces highlighting the dark circles under their eyes. But there was something in their expressions, even in sleep, that reminded him of Sarah, a combination of strength and gentleness that had drawn him to her all those years ago. "Are you really our daddy?" Emma asked suddenly, her eyes opening to find Richard watching her. The question hit him harder than any business negotiation or hostile takeover he'd ever faced. "I am," he said softly. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you." Emma considered this with the seriousness that chronically ill children often develop. "Mama said our daddy had to go away, but that he loved us anyway." Richard glanced at Sarah, who was pretending to read a magazine while listening to every word. "Your mama was right. I did have to go away, but I should have come back sooner. I should have been here to help take care of you and Ethan." "Are you going to help us get better?" Ethan asked, his voice weak but hopeful. "I'm going to do everything I can," Richard promised. "We're going to go on a special airplane to a hospital where the best doctors in the world are going to fix your hearts." Both children looked to their mother for confirmation. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed in front of them. "Will you come with us?" Emma asked Richard. "If your mama says it's okay, I'll stay with you the whole time." The medical transport arrived exactly on schedule, a state-of-the-art jet equipped with a full medical team and life support equipment. As the children were carefully transferred to the specialized gurneys, Richard found himself walking beside Sarah toward the plane. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said quietly. "I know this isn't the life you planned." Richard stopped walking and turned to face her. "Sarah, 26 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I let fear and selfishness drive away. The best thing that had ever happened to me. I can't change that, but I can try to be the man you deserved then, and the father Emma and Ethan deserve now. What if this doesn't work? What if the surgery? Then we'll face whatever comes together, all of us." As the plane lifted off from the small airstrip outside Cedar Falls, Richard Sterling looked down at the town that had changed his life in 24 hours. Below them, the mountains of Montana stretched toward the horizon, their peaks catching the last light of day. Beside him, Sarah held their children's hands while machines monitored their vital signs. For the first time in his adult life, Richard wasn't thinking about stock prices, development deals, or profit margins. He was thinking about a 4-year-old girl who'd asked if he was really her daddy, and a little boy who'd shared his crayon drawing of a family that had never been, but somehow always should have been. The surgery would take place in 18 hours. Dr. Chen had warned them that while the procedure had a high success rate, there were always risks when operating on children so young and fragile. Richard had built his fortune by calculating risks and making strategic decisions, but this was different. This was about love, redemption, and the possibility that some mistakes could be forgiven, if not forgotten. As the plane flew through the night toward Boston, carrying a broken family toward an uncertain future, Richard Sterling finally understood what his mother had tried to teach him about the Sterling Foundation's mission. It wasn't about tax deductions or public relations. It was about using wealth and privilege to make a difference in lives that mattered. And no lives had ever mattered more to him than the 2 small children sleeping fitfully in the medical bay, dreaming of a future where they could run and play like other children, loved by both parents who had finally found their way back to each other and to the family they'd created together. The dawn would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and a surgery that would determine whether Emma and Ethan Sterling would have the chance to grow up healthy and strong. But for now, as the plane carried them through the darkness toward hope, Richard Sterling held his daughter's small hand and finally understood what it meant to be a father. The end. This heartwarming tale of redemption and second chances reminds us that love can overcome even the deepest regrets, and that family bonds, once discovered, can heal wounds that seem permanent. Richard Sterling's journey from selfish millionaire to devoted father shows that it's never too late to choose love over fear, and that the most valuable investments we make are in the lives of those we love. Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.